Hey guys, welcome back to my channel. Today we're going to talk about my favorite thing in the world, or one of my favorite things, poetry. I know it's not everybody's cup of tea, but I do want to implement more videos on poetry, about poetry on my channel. And a few months ago, I had the idea of filming a video called My Favorite Poems. I've shared my favorite books and I've shared my favorite things on this channel, but I haven't actually shared my favorite poems. So today I'm going to bring you 5 of my favorite poems. I'm going to give you some facts about the poets, and we're going to do a short and tiny little analysis on each poem. I want to be a more avid reader of poetry. I read everything that I can get my hands on, but to really open up a poetry collection and dive into the works of individual poets has sadly not been part of my routine. So I do want to do that in the future. And if you've been around this channel for a long time, you know that I always did these book wrap-ups each month. So after every month I would do a video on the books that I've read. And although I haven't done that in a few months, I will do it at the end of the year. But I actually thought of maybe doing that with poetry. Obviously there's going to be book-related content, university-related content, or lifestyle-related content on my channel. I thought of maybe opening up the new category of poetry wrap-ups, where I talk about the poems that I read each month and maybe dive into them a little bit, and also motivate myself to read more poetry. So that's a project that I'm excited about. But for today, to introduce this sort of new section on poetry, I thought I'd tell you about some of my favorite poems. I need my book and my analysis. So I actually analyzed each poem, which was lots of fun. Before we start, I just want to say poetry is obviously subjective to each reader. The way that I see or interpret a poem doesn't have to align with your view of it. Poetry is first and foremost art, and we should treat it as such. Okay, we're starting right away. I'm buzzing, I'm excited. I'm going to introduce each poem with a few facts about the author, and then we're going to dive in to the work itself. Okay, so the first poem we have is I'm Afraid to Own a Body by Emily Dickinson. She is a 19th century American writer. She lived from 1830 to 1886 in Amherst, Massachusetts. Her poems are immediately recognizable, at least to me at this point, because they have a very specific sort of look. I'm trying to do them justice, okay? I'm afraid to own a body. I'm afraid to own a soul. Profound, precarious property. Possession, not optional. Double estate, entailed at pleasure, upon an unsuspecting heir, duke in a moment of deathlessness, and God for a frontier. We have a 2-stanza poem with 4 lines each. We have an alternate rhyme scheme, so A, B, A, B, and in the second verse we have C, D, E, D, so a very clean rhyming scheme. It does have rhythm. It does have what I call a very clean look, which brings me to sort of my first point, which is the contrast of the writing to the tone of the poem. This is a very questioning human existence poem, in my opinion. The statement of I'm afraid to own a body, I'm afraid to own a soul is very clear. It's like the speaker already knows of that fear. They've been reflecting on that sort of scenario for a long time before even writing this poem. The content has a very philosophical feel. Whenever I think of philosophy, my brain at least turns tons of thoughts around and it's quite chaotic in there most of the time. But Emily writes it in such an orderly way with the 2 stanzas and 4-line form. She puts in a ton of alliteration and anaphora, like I'm afraid to own a body, I'm afraid to own a soul. The plosive P, profound, precarious property, possession, not optional. There's 5 P's in there. Another plosive, the D, double estate, duke in a moment of deathlessness. So all these alliteration and anaphora are usually there to create a rhythm, create a sort of uniformity. It also has an aesthetic purpose. Let's dive into this content more. I feel like the first stanza is more accessible than the second one, because first we only talk about I'm afraid to own a body, I'm afraid to own a soul, and then the speaker describes that sort of relationship between body and soul, and then the next one the speaker reflects. What is happening here is that the speaker tackles the relationship between faith and reason. Faith here being represented by the soul and reason by the body. Emily Dickinson wrote a lot about her relationship to God and religion. She was, on the one hand, very religious. She grew up with it. She went to church. But on the other hand, her brain, her creative mind, and her poetry led her to question a lot of things. And this poem kind of wants the reader to do that as well. Because back then, to kind of question this sort of whole phenomenon of faith and religion and what happens after death. Do we really have a soul? When science was kind of coming up, the speaker, at least in this poem, struggles to sort of obtain the symbiosis of how these two can exist at the same time. The second stanza is sort of the exploration of what happens once you start reflecting or just questioning these sorts of things. The reader becomes the unsuspecting heir, not really knowing what is happening, and through this questioning process, the speaker becomes the Duke of Deathlessness. There's a defiance of mortality, which in that time was frowned upon, and the speaker knows that too, because in the end it cautions the reader to take a step back and not lose yourself in that sort of thinking process. Even though you can start questioning things, you should never go as far as to lose yourself in that entire wave of feelings. What drew me to this poem was not necessarily the content of it, so the contemplation of body, soul entanglement. It was more first of all, the first line, I'm afraid to own a body, which I could relate to. First of all, it's just such a beautiful, beautiful thing to write. This is gonna become a theme because poetry, for me, it's not necessarily about its contents or the speaker's message. It's more about the words that the poet chose. For me, there's nothing more beautiful than words being written down. What I love is contrast, whether it be in paintings or in poetry. And in this one, I love the contrast between what I already touched on, content and tone. Again, this sort of contemplation about human existence, philosophically trying to detach oneself, to be able to even think about these sort of things in order to even contemplate it, and then the division of soul and body because of the outside of the poem. So the way that the stanzas, the lines, the rhyme scheme, the rhythm, the words chosen, alliteration and anaphora, all this is the opposite of what the speaker is talking about. For me, it has a very thought out, sophisticated and reflected tone, which in my opinion does not fit the content of the poem. I hope you understood what I was just talking about, because that was very confusing even to my brain. Emily Dickinson is one of my favorite poets because of that, because when I read her poetry, most of the time I have no idea what she's talking about, but I fall in love with her voice regardless. Let's continue. I already talked for 30 minutes. This is gonna be a long video. Now the next poem is, if some people were to ask me what's your favorite poem, that would be my answer, I think. We're talking about Robert Frost's Fire and Ice. Robert Frost was also an American poet. He wrote during the modernist period. He lived from 1874 to 1963. So the poem I want to read to you is one that if you watched the third part of Twilight, you will know. Let's go. Some say the world will end in fire. Some say in ice. From what I've tasted of desire, I hold with those who favor fire. But if it had to perish twice, I think I know enough of hate to know that for destruction, ice is also great and would suffice. We have another poem that is full of contrast. While we first talked about the questioning of human existence and the relationship between faith and reason, now we're talking about the world ending, but also, in my opinion, a very sophisticated and reflected sort of tone of voice. We have a, from the outside, very simple looking poem. An alternate rhyme scheme, A, B, A, B. We also have another anaphora. Some say the world will end fire, some say in ice. But let's talk more about the content. The speaker contemplates in what kind of way the world could end after, in my interpretation, the speaker lived a long life. I wrote down, it's a peaceful contemplation of how the world might end, and it not really being important since the speaker has lived a full life. The speaker chooses words that for me are very surface level. Some say the world will end in fire, and some say in ice. And then the speaker lets us know, after his experience of life, his opinion would be. Let's talk about fire and ice. We have opposites, which I'm in love with. We have fire, which the speaker associates with desire, and we have ice. Even though the speaker does not associate that with their sort of world-ending view, they say that that sort of feeling that ice elicits can still be destructive enough to destroy the world. Fire, in this case, would stand for lots of passion, this active sort of hatred, and ice, in my opinion at least, takes more of a passive role. It's this cool, sort of untreated hatred that spreads. We have imagery in this poem. We have fire and ice, both holding and conjuring completely different images in one's head. I don't think I need to elaborate on that. I think that's pretty clear. Ice also stands for this indifference and emotional detachment, whereas fire acts quickly and it's all-consuming. The fact that the speaker aligns with fire more says a lot about their life, and we could talk about this for hours, but we won't. What I think I love most is the specific use of repetition in this poem. We have fire and ice, which are both repeated twice, and the speaker talks about the world ending twice. And I love this. It's these tiny things that make writing, that make a poem so interesting and so unique, and I love it. It's so much fun. I'm sorry. I need to come down. Again, lots of opposites and contrasts in this poem. I talked about this. Again, the tone versus the content. I love it. I think I'm going to write my thesis on this. I do want to talk about the historical context of this poem. It is said to be written and published shortly after World War I, so 1920. There are two reported inspirations for this poem. First, it would be Dante's Inferno, which is a poetic and and literary journey into hell from the 14th century, or maybe and a conversation that Frost allegedly had with an astronomer where they talked about the sun either someday extinguishing or exploding. And again, we're talking about the world ending. I am usually not that big of a fan of eschatology. I think that's how you say it. I'm so sorry if I say it wrong. It's the part of theology concerned with things ending. It has Greek roots, sort of the last study. So it's all about things ending, the life ending, a day ending, someone ending. Usually I'm not that big of a fan of the contemplation of it. I like the entire imagery and aesthetic and the atmosphere it creates when you talk about death and all things surrounding death, but how someone would die, how the world might end, it's not something that I really think about. It's not something that I really want to think about. The fact that this poem still means a lot to me and is still one of my favorite poems is simply because the way that it is written. And I love it. And before I start crying, let's continue. Moving on in order of when these poets lived, we are next tackling Edna St. Vincent Millay's Time Does Not Bring Relief, Sonnet 2, at least in my edition. Edna St. Vincent Millay, another American poet, she also wrote during the modernist era. She lived from 1892 to 1950. In the past year, she's become one of my favorite poets. Time does not bring relief, you all have lied, who told me time would ease me of my pain. I miss him in the weeping of the rain, I want him at the shrinking of the tide. The old snows melt from every mountainside, and last year's leaves are smoke in every lane. But last year's bitter loving must remain heaped on my heart, and my old thoughts abide. There are 100 places where I fear to go, so with his memory they brim, and entering with relief some quiet place where never fell his foot or shone his face. I say, there is no memory of him here, and so stand stricken, so remembering him. Grief is one of the things that has been incredibly present in my life lately, and which also has been one of the hardest things that I've been trying to tackle within my own poetry. And this year in January, I sort of had a breakthrough where I wrote a poem that for the first time made it happen that I was able to write about this aspect of life. And in the last 3 years, 3 of my dogs have died. If you didn't know, I've had 5 dogs and now it's down to 2. The last death that we experienced was in February, and it was very, very unexpected. And reading things on grief and writing about grief is, I think, one of the, for me at least, one of the most difficult things. I think this poem is sort of perfect for it. I mean, the way she starts writing, time does not bring relief, you all have lied when you told me time would ease me of my pain. I love this line because the idea of time heals all wounds, we have that in German as well, Zeit heilt alle Wunden. It's just not true. At least for me, once I've experienced death for the first time in my life, or sort of went through a grieving process, I immediately abolished the idea of time healing all wounds. Time does heal wounds, but when it comes to grief, it doesn't necessarily heal everything. And yes, I totally understand that you can still say this and mean that sort of thing, that it just gets easier. But I, as a person that is very careful about the words that she chooses when it comes to at least poetry, it is not a good representation of what, for me at least, grief is. The pain that I feel is still the exact same stinging pain that I felt in the first second of feeling it. The body and the mind and everything just gets used to it. And it never gets easier. I'm crying. I didn't want to cry. I feel like Millay has a perfect representation of this. Obviously, we again have contrast. We have the rain, we have the smoke. Again, we have water imagery, which always represents at least a very emotional journey for me. Weeping of the rain, shrinking of the tide, personification. I'm browsing through these literary devices because I love them, but I know that it bores a lot of people and I need to get this video done. So we start with a statement, an exploration of the feelings, a statement again. But last year's bitter loving must remain heaped on my heart and my old thoughts abide, meaning that it's inescapable. Grief stays and there's no turning it off. And then we again return to a sort of exploration of the feelings where the speaker tells us, I can't go anywhere without thinking of him. In this case, it's a hymn. I love sonnets. I love writing sonnets. Knowing what a sonnet is, its characters, and being able to spot it is just one of my favorite things that I've learned in my studies. I could talk about this poem for another hour, but I think this is the one that is the most clear on its message. And I think my favorite line is, I miss him in the weeping of the rain. I love personifications so much, and the imagery the speaker chooses is just a perfect representation of everything. I love when people include elements in poetry. It's what I do as well, because elements are all around us: fire, water, air, and earth, and Millay chooses all of them and creates this imagery around grief even more omnipresent and all-encompassing. We are continuing with Mary Oliver. Mary Oliver is another American poet, and she lived from 1935 to 2019, and she wrote such a fun poem, which I can't wait to read to you. It's called That Little Beast. Alright. Ooh, oh no! That little beast. That pretty little beast, a poem, has a mind of its own. Sometimes I wanted to crave apples, but it wants red meat. Sometimes I want to walk peacefully on the shore, and it wants to take off all its clothes and dive in. Sometimes I want to use small words and make them important, and it starts shouting the dictionary, the opportunities. Sometimes I want to sum up and give thanks, putting things in order, and it starts dancing around the room on its 4 furry legs, laughing and calling me outrageous. But sometimes, when I'm thinking about you, and no doubt smiling, it sits down quietly, one paw under its chin, and just listens. I love this so much. We have a 4-stanza, 21-line poem with no specific rhyme scheme. Some words do rhyme, a lot of them don't. The anaphora, which sort of introduces almost every single stanza, sometimes I want, creates order and rhythm. But what is it really about? The beast that the speaker is talking about is a poem. It's a metaphor and a personification because a poem cannot be a beast. A poem cannot do all these things, but that's what a personification does. It gets animalistic characteristics, which I love. And basically it's about a lack of control a poet, and I'm saying poet here, poet has when it comes to writing a poem. And while reading it, it was a perfect representation of what happens to me when I write poetry. It might sound strange, and I don't know if a lot of people experience it, but my favorite poems that I wrote happened when I wasn't thinking. It happened when I was completely in a moment where the creative side of my brain was able to just take control and write whatever it wanted. And I had zero control over it. And this is what the poem is about as well. That's why I was able to relate to it. The poem, which is being written, literally has a mind of its own. Even though the poet might have an intention, sort of like, sometimes I wanted to crave apples, or sometimes I want to walk peacefully on the shore. The thing that is being written turns it around and says, no, actually I want red meat. Actually, I do want to tear off my clothes and run into the water. And I love it so much because this thing that is so abstract that I feel weird about talking, Oliver is creating images for that are easily accessible, that you can just grasp. It's tangible. It feels like you see it in front of your eyes, and it explains it so well that even though you might have an intention, that intention might not end up on paper. I love how people play around with words and how poetry can be something that is so uniquely your own, and even though you choose your words, other people can relate to it. And that is not the most important thing for me in poetry. I do not seek out poetry because I relate to it, but this was a perfect representation and I loved it so much. We do have to talk about the last stanza because it changes up the tone. While the speaker complained before, this becomes much softer when the speaker brings in the third party, which is the undefined you. And with that last stanza, the speaker tells us everything we need to know about that relationship to that person, to that you. I could easily say now and just put it out there that that relationship is probably a happy one. That relationship is probably one that gives great comfort. That relationship is probably very healthy. The speaker feels like they're in control, which means that they feel like they are good together. When it comes to that person, the speaker's mind is clear, and the poem, The Beast, doesn't do anything because this time the poet, or in this case the speaker, is in full control of what is happening. I love it so, so much. It's so pretty. Just saying, but sometimes when I'm thinking about you, and no doubt smiling, it sits down quietly, one paw under its chin, and just listens. What is really lovely, I wrote about the human-dog relationship because even though the speaker does not define what sort of beast a poem is, the speaker does use criteria that would align with a dog-like being. Humans and dogs have been in companionship for centuries. This sort of aspect of dogs being true friends to humans, they're always present, they're trusting. For me, it's very relatable. It's so nice because the speaker doesn't think about their art as something that is just themselves. It's something that is a companion, it's a friend, and it has, again, a mind of its own. And that's sort of how I think about poetry and the way that I write. We continue with the last one. Now the last one is actually by a contemporary poet called Wendy Cope. She was born in 1945 and is still alive. Wendy Cope is a British poet, and if you know anything about poetry and have heard her name before, you will know what poem comes next. The Orange. At lunchtime, I bought a huge orange. The size of it made us all laugh. I peeled it and shared it with Robert and Dave. They got quarters, and I had a half. And that orange, it made me so happy, as ordinary things often do. Just lately, the shopping, a walk in the park, this is peace and contentment. It's new. The rest of the day was quite easy. I did all the jobs on my list, and enjoyed them, and had some time over. I love you. I'm glad I exist. Speaker buys an orange. It's huge, and it reminds them of all the things that are quite ordinary but beautiful, at least right now in this moment. The I love you lets me to believe that the you, again, is precisely the reason why things, as ordinary as they might seem, are so enjoyable and make the speaker so happy, because they say, and that orange should make me so happy, as ordinary things often do, just lately. That little I love you sort of stumps the reader first, in my opinion. It's like, huh? Wait, what? We were talking about the orange, and then we were talking about ordinary things that make us happy, and now we have an I love you, which is sort of random, but it's also the most important thing in the poem. Every stanza has 4 lines. We have sort of an alternate rhyme scheme. We have A, B, C, B, D, E, F, E, and D, E, G, H, G. The first stanza just illustrates the situation. The second one is what is triggered by the situation, reflecting on the other situations, and then it further triggers a reflection on why the speaker has these emotions, on why the speaker is happy lately. The tone is light-hearted. It, in my opinion, has a very happy and funny atmosphere, and Wendy Cope in general is amazing at writing funny and humorous poems. Reading it actually makes me really happy, and its message makes me happy, which, again, as I told you, is not the most important thing when it comes to poetry, for me at least. It's not huge imagery, it doesn't beat about the bush. It's a simple representation of ordinary life being a reason why someone should be happy. And it's a clever poem. I feel like this list is a perfect representation of what I love about poetry. Emily Dickinson's I'm Afraid to Own a Body represents the beauty I associate with words, even though I might not understand what the poet or what the speaker is talking about. Robert Frost's Fire and Ice illustrates the contrast and opposite that I love, and all the things that can be found in a small or rather short poem. Time Does Not Bring Relief, You All Have Lied tackles one of the most difficult things in a human's life, in my opinion, and is a perfect and beautiful representation of the heartfelt truth, and it represents the melancholy and sad feelings that I really connect with and that I really like writing about. That Little Beast by Mary Oliver represents my relationship with poetry, and then in the end we have The Orange by Wendy Cope, which represents the joy of reading poetry for me. I love that. I didn't even notice it while I was creating that list. That was a great ending to the video, I think. This was officially one of my favorite videos that I ever made, just because if you've been watching, you get it. I love talking about this. I never thought that poetry would one day become so important to me. When I was at school and I was learning it, I hated it. I couldn't find any meaning to it. It makes sense that at that time I couldn't connect to it. And I'm so glad that my life has led me to a relationship to that art form. I'm really happy about this. That was a lot of fun. I hope you had fun too, hearing me talk about poetry. If you have any favorite poems, I would love to know about it. Please write them in the comments and tell me your reasons on why you love that specific poem. I will see you in my next video. Again, there's still going to be other content for the people who are not interested in poetry, but I do want to talk more about poetry also to motivate myself, as I said in the beginning. Thank you so much for watching if you watched this far. It's incredible. Have a lovely day or night or whenever you're watching this, and I'll hopefully see you in my next video. Bye guys!